Iceland prides itself on its use of renewables. The government says that about 85% of its total energy supply comes from a mix of hydropower and geothermal sources. That's the highest proportion of renewable power for any nation in the world. But it's also using this renewable energy to capture and store CO2. Carbon capture and storage, or CCS, is one of the many technologies the IPCC says could help reduce global warming and avert climate catastrophe. And to do that, these giant fans are sucking CO2 directly from the surrounding air, just like a giant vacuum cleaner.
First and foremost, we need to stop emitting CO2 and we have to decarbonize our energy systems. But in addition to that, we need to store a lot of CO2. And this is mostly CO2 that is derived from industrial processes that we will still rely on, even though we manage to phase out fossil fuels. The method that Carbfix has developed is to mineralize CO2, so essentially to turn CO2 into stone. And for that, we need a certain type of rock, volcanic rock such as basalt.
This geothermal power station is where Snæbjørnsdóttir is working on the mineralization process, and these igloos are where it happens. The pipes here channel CO2 mixed with water underground to a depth of around 800 meters or more than 2,600 feet.
These rocks are very permeable, so they are kind of like a sponge. We have a lot of pores and fractures for the CO2 charged fluid to flow through. It has been estimated that over 100 kilos of CO2 can be stored in each cubic meter.
The CO2 comes from two sources. One is the geothermal plant itself.
Geothermal is of course green energy, but it still emits some CO2. This plant emits about 3% of what a fossil fuel burning plant of similar size would emit.
The second source of CO2 is the atmosphere, and this is where the fans come in. The Orca plant, named after the Icelandic word for energy, is run by a Swiss company called Climeworks. They say it's the world's largest direct air capture facility. It captures around 4,000 tons of CO2 per year, but the global energy demand for 2021 alone is predicted to emit 33 billion tons.
For this to make sense, it has to become much more expensive to emit the CO2. We need to start putting the real price tag on our emissions. We cannot continue to go on like this, where it's actually much cheaper just to let it go.
Also, this method of carbon capture and storage is incredibly energy intensive, especially at the capture site. And some critics argue that the process will delay industries from making the switch away from fossil fuels.
You should not use this technology to decarbonize your industry. First and foremost, you should eliminate the CO2 emissions as much as possible. Carbon capture and storage is a solution, and it's one of the many solutions that we need to implement. We cannot meet the goals of the Paris Agreement without storing vast amounts of CO2.
Looking beyond Iceland, Carbfix has created a worldwide database to show where other basalt formations could be used to store CO2. And it's also creating a plan for a fleet of specially designed ships to transport it.
The distribution system that we have set in place to be able to distribute all this oil and gas throughout the world and in every remote location. From offshore oil fields via pipelines over borders and ships and wherever. This is maybe not as sci-fi as we think.
This is a planet worth protecting. Tell us how you're answering the call with the hashtag #CallToEarth.